videos in, and I am back on my BS with a nonfiction book. This one is called Let Us Die Like Men by William Lee White. It is about the Battle of Franklin in the Civil War. Franklin is not very far from where I have lived my whole life, in different towns around Franklin. I am very well aware of the Franklin battlefield. I just went to Carnton not long ago, well, like a week ago, because that was when the anniversary of the battle was. So they have a special night there where they let people in free for a very shortened tour, and they let them go in at night, and it's maybe a 15-minute tour. It's very truncated, but also it's very free, and that is where I picked up this book, at the gift shop. So I am very, very familiar with Franklin, the area, and have always heard about the battle. I've been to the Lotes house, been to the Carter house. Carnton was probably the one I hadn't been to in the longest, but was just recently there. I have been around Fort Granger. I have hiked around that area. Frankly, if you go to Franklin, you can't avoid this battle because there's markers everywhere, because this battle went through town. And this was one of the last gasps of the Confederacy here in the South. It was a major blunder of an attack on different ends. Ironically, it almost worked. There were certain situations in this battle where things almost went in favor of the Confederacy, which is shocking based on how bad this plan was and how bungled things got. And it wasn't even necessarily the fault of the people doing the bungling in some cases. It's just how things happened. One particular, the Missourians, who ended up attacking by themselves in the front line, head-on, into a entrenched Union army, were supposed to be supported, but it just so happened, because of how they were marching, two of the groups that were supposed to support them got caught up. One of them was the Mississippians, and I forget who the other one was, but they sort of got caught in other altercations getting forward, and it ended up with the Missourians, who were kind of an elite force by this point in the war, just getting wiped out. And some of them actually did make it up to the defenses, did make it over in some cases. One of the charges that happened later on did break through about 200 yards, these very desperate charges that ended up with them actually breaking through, and it just so happened the Union pushed that, and had their own desperate charge and pushed that back. One of the biggest questions in this whole battle is how the Union even got past the Confederacy to begin with, because they were actually blocked from Franklin pretty much in Spring Hill. And Hood, who was the Confederate commander, was told that that road leading to Franklin was going to be blocked. Schofield, the Union troops were on their way back to Nashville. They were kind of pushing their way back there because that was the safest place for them to be at this point. Hood had the bulk of the Southern Army. He had the bulk of the Army of Tennessee that was left. Now, there were two armies of Tennessee. There was one that was Union, and there was one that was Confederacy. And Hood had the bulk of the one that was still active for the Confederacy. And Schofield knew that he really needed to get back to Nashville. So he is backing up, because he's outnumbered. He's backing up. He thinks he can go through Franklin and get back to Nashville in safety, because Nashville was held by the Union for most of the war. And he doesn't realize until he gets to Franklin that flooding had ruined the pontoon boats that they were supposed to go across the Harpeth on. Well, Franklin is in a horseshoe bend of the Harpeth River, so there was nowhere else for the Union to go. So the Union troops had to stop. And that's where Hood felt that since they were backed up against the Harpeth, this was his major opportunity to attack them. he had initially thought he was going to get that major opportunity to attack them because they were cut off from Nashville during the campaign where he had them at Spring Hill. The problem there is those roads, like I said, were supposed to be blocked off to keep them from getting past them, the Confederacy, into Franklin and then Nashville. And Hood was promised that by lots of different commanders that he had under him, but that never happened for some odd reason. And also for some odd reason, no one ever raised an alarm when the Union troops pretty much took their whole baggage train and their people overnight up that pike into Franklin. And Hood obviously realized he had missed a huge opportunity there by that whole bungling of situations happening. And he was not going to miss his chance when he realized that the Union was trapped in Franklin from attacking them again. Now, this attack was desperate. It was nasty. This was some of the worst hand-to-hand fighting that I've ever heard about in Tennessee. There's a lot of accounts in here about people basically tackling each other. There are people bludgeoning each other with butts of guns. One really grotesque account where one talks about a man's head, what happened after it was bludgeoned with a gun. Here one of the things that is mentioned in this book a lot that does not get brought up when we talk about the battle a lot of times is the fact that the Confederacy was going up against these sort of they're not fortifications, they were defensive lines that were made up of Osage orange trees and locust trees. Osage oranges, if you have ever dealt with them, they're very, very hardwood. They're not really native to this area. They came up here with the Indians trading a lot of times. Native Americans wanted them for their very hard wood because they were used for bows. And they now are just an invasive species up here. And these Osage orange trees were all around, and we call them hedge apples, a lot of the fruits that fall off of them. But they're kind of thorny too, and these trees were cut down and used to make these sort of barricades that these lines were going up against. The same with locust. Locusts are a tree that is native to here that is very thorny. So they were making these walls, these fences out of these different, very hard to get through, like hedges in a lot of situations. So the problem was when the Confederacy would get up to the Union line, they were then having to try to figure out how to hack their way through what amounted to these really thorny, dense hedges that were hard to get through. And they were talking about how a lot of these people ended up stuck in the fences. That's really kind of where a lot of the line ends up getting caught having to slow down, and that's where you're getting your discrepancies about which troops are moving forward and which are not being able to keep up. It's because they're getting caught in these different areas where these hedges, these man-made hedges were. So this book is very, very readable, and it is very, very well explained about what went on in Franklin and how the layout was. There are a lot of pictures, a lot of maps. I have never seen so many pictures and maps in one book about a battle. And just tons of pictures of all the major players, the people who were involved, minor people that I did not know things about, how they were involved, pictures of them, all sorts of stories he tries to clear up because there were a lot of stories that were told about this battle and kind of legendary. One of the main ones is about Todd Carter, who the Carter House is over in Franklin. It was where some of the heaviest fighting was. It was also the home of Todd Carter, who was in the Confederate Army. His family lived there. He was actually kind of a secretary sort of position, and he asked to be part of the charge that went where his farm was, and he was given permission, and he was shot multiple times and killed in the Battle of Franklin. He ended up dying at home because he was found not very far away from his home. It was one of the stories that goes on. Lots of very interesting just sad, because it is the last gasp of something that there's still an air of, with the Civil War, there was still an air when they described this of kind of, I don't know how to say it other than this, like, kind of a image around it, where war still had this sort of glamour to it. We get into World War I later on as our, like, next major war that the United States is involved in, and that one does not have the glamour of the Civil War still, where you still have this chivalry and rules and all this sort of stuff that you had going into it, the thinking that was what you had going into it. It was not the case, because war is just war in any way around it, but it still had this sort of image to it that there's a lot of talk in this on both sides, and in the Union side even, of basically watching the Army of Tennessee destroy itself in this sort of grand spectacle that was amazing to watch, which reminds me of that quote that they talk about with the Charge of the Light Brigade, that yes, it's amazing, but it's not war. And it's this sort of just horrific last gasp of this very, very grandiose group that had this image around it. And there's also in the beginning some very, very interesting talking about the U.S. colored troops, the USCT, that were involved in some of the fighting before the Battle of Franklin down in Alabama and Georgia, as Hood is coming up through that area to Tennessee. And they talk about some of the situations with them that does not get mentioned much in a lot of Civil War histories. That is really fascinating, how they were involved in different things and what happened to them after they were captured by the Confederate troops. The whole situation with this battle, it is, I almost say more than Gettysburg, this one is so much more kind of watching a dying animal. And that whole sort of situation in Franklin, because it was fought in a town, it was fought where a lot of people witnessed things. It was fought where just horrific things happened. Carnton Plantation was turned into a hospital after the battle, and there are still, it's well known that there are still bloodstains all over the floor. You can still see them. They're everywhere on the floor, because it was used as a hospital. Near the windows, it's especially bad because that's where the surgeons were, and that's where they were doing amputations. So the Civil War has left this mark on Franklin that they have embraced in a certain way and sort of made that part of their tourism and part of their small town charmness. So they're not small town charm in Tennessee. We call them that they're the rich people in Franklin, whether they are or not living in Franklin. Franklin is known as an affluent area. That is something that they have sort of embraced and used that as part of their identity, and have embraced it. It has been embraced in a much more even way now, where I believe a lot of the truth of what happened with what sides, and how the African American troops were used and how they were involved, and also how these plantations and things in this area did have enslaved people and what that sort of meant. It's been much more even-handedly dealt with now. It used to be very much the glory of the South situation that has always been a problem when the losers of the war get to write their own history in a lot of ways. And I know that's going to make people angry, but that is what happened, and I say that as a Southern person. So it's very interesting to see how the battle actually went, to see this sort of last glorious charge of the Confederacy. It's not. The war still drags on for a good chunk, but this was such a horrendous event that ends up happening and has such ramifications, because it basically just blasts the Army of Tennessee apart. There's not much left after that. You've got whole regiments that just are destroyed. The I think it's the 4th Missourian is just no longer exists. And a lot of blunders and a lot of infighting that you see how things happen just because people were infighting with each other so much, the commanders, and different things, and how people had different opinions about how you were supposed to do the fighting. So this book I would recommend a lot, even if you're not a big Civil War buff. Civil War is not something that's not my favorite history to go with, just because there is so much discrepancy with it when you find reading, especially older reading, that it's very slanted and very incorrect because a lot of times because of how it was done. So it's just recently I'm finding more stuff that is very even with how they're dealing about things, and this is one of them. It's very readable, very understandable, and probably the best understanding I've had of what happened in Franklin after coming out of reading this book. So if you are interested in Civil War history or just history in general, I would suggest this one, and it's called Let Us Die Like Men by William Lee White.